Welcome to the Homeschool Show from North Carolinians for Home Education. Our goal is to help you homeschool with confidence and joy. I'm your host, Matthew McNeil, and we have as our co-host today, Rhonda Marshall.
Hey.
How's it going?
It's going great.
Well, we're at the HSLDA Homeschool Leaders Conference, the National Homeschool Leaders Conference. So we have states from all over the nation meeting here at Ridgecrest in North Carolina, which we're glad for because that's at home for us. Yeah. And so we're being encouraged by all the other states who are trying to do the same things that we are. And some of the interviews that we'll be showing today and next week are from this conference. So tell us what we have today.
Well, first of all, in homeschool news, we're going to give you a legislative update, really important stuff, and then also a field trip deadline for the Nutcracker Ballet. Mm-hmm. And then in Homeschool Conversations, Matthew had a conversation with Pastor Chris Butler right here at the HSLDA National Leaders Conference. He is a pastor of the Chicago Embassy Church Network, so we're excited to hear from him. He was a keynote speaker here, right? And then in Wisdom from the Word, Matthew is going to encourage us to step up to the battles that God is calling homeschool parents to fight. And then finally, with Homeschool Helps with Amanda, she's going to continue her series of homeschool misinformation, and especially those things that are people misinform us about testing. So we'll look at that. What do scores mean? And what do we have to do with the scores?
Right. Great. So starting off with homeschool news, we really have some good news from the North Carolina General Assembly about some of the bills that we've been watching. As you know, we've been telling you about the legislation that we introduced to make it open and possible for homeschool students to get the PSAT and AP tests in the public school setting. And that got moved around from this bill to that bill. Well, now it ended up on the budget bill, and it has now passed. Yay. So we're really encouraged about that, and it looks like it's going to go through. And so it may not be in time for some of us this year, but next year we're going to be wide open to make sure those tests are taking place for homeschool students. Also in this budget bill was the issue of opportunity scholarships, but in this case the homeschoolers were not included in that. And then we have HB 600, which is going to exempt homeschool co-ops from the child care regulations. This also is halfway through and looks like it should go through very soon. Probably by the time you see this, it looks like everything will be going through so that homeschool co-ops are exempt from the child care law, which will make it easier for them to operate. So that's good news.
That's very, very good news. So also about the Nutcracker Ballet, that's coming up in December. You don't want to miss it, but there's an important deadline that's coming up to get your tickets. So it's December 15th is when the show is actually, and it's in Charlotte, but you have until October 4th to get tickets. You can still get tickets after October 4th, but they're just going to be a higher price.
And October 4th is 2 days from when this episode releases.
Yes. So get on the tickets.
This is Monday. If you're watching it when it comes out, you have 2 days to get those tickets with the discount.
Awesome. So now we're going to move into our homeschool conversation. And as I told you earlier, Matthew had a conversation with Pastor Chris Butler. He was a keynote speaker here at the HSLDA National Leaders Conference. And he's the pastor of Chicago Embassy Church Network. And he's going to talk about how homeschooling is a movement that can make a kingdom impact. And he also encourages Black homeschool families in their homeschool journey. So let's take a look.
All right, I'm here with Chris Butler from Chicago. I'm at the HSLDA Leaders Conference, and I just heard a session with Chris talking about how the homeschool movement can impact the world.
Yeah.
Pretty big topic.
Yes, indeed.
Give us a little summary of what your heart is about that.
Yeah, I mean, it really came to me as I was praying to come to this conference and seeing what the Lord might say. And it's just the idea that this is a movement that's kind of been faithful in obscurity for a long time. And I believe that God wants to begin to use the people who are in this movement to move into new and different spaces in new and different ways. And as we're sort of introducing communities and people to homeschooling, we're also able to introduce them to Christ, and to a way, just a way of doing life, that is more fruitful and flourishing from the individual soul all the way to kind of like the society thing.
So I've been trying to think about the connection between revival from a strictly kingdom perspective and homeschooling. I mean, what is it about homeschooling that is either unique or foundational or principally related to a movement of God?
Yeah. So I think that the movement of God is all about disciple making.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that we've kind of missed for, those of us who study revival and think about revival and pray for revival, is that it's not just convert making, it's disciple making. And what homeschooling gives you the opportunity to do is make disciples, especially for those of us who are in homeschool leadership positions, who are, creating co-ops and learning centers. And this has given us opportunity to regularly talk to students, talk to parents, be in community, and really build those discipleship relationships. And I'm really convinced, as somebody who, I study revival, I pray for revival, I think about revival. And one of the things I've been convinced for a long time is that the next revival is not going to come through pulpit preachers. And kind of like the revivalists that we think about of yesteryear, but almost like the 1,000 points of light sort of a dynamic. And homeschool is a great opportunity for that, because you get opportunity to preach, especially in this culture where people don't want to be preached to. Homeschooling, you can preach to people, they don't necessarily know that they're being preached to, but you're able to do it. And so I think it's one of those avenues that God can really use, to bring people, to sort of be that bridge between somebody who doesn't know the Lord and the Lord himself.
So what we need to do is encourage and equip all the homeschool families to be all those points of light. So how can we do that right now? Our audience is the homeschool community, and how can we encourage homeschool families to participate in that, to engage in that ministry?
Yeah. So one of the things that I hear a lot, and I probably say it plenty, because it's true, homeschooling is not for everybody.
Okay.
But homeschooling is possible for way more people than are currently doing.
Yeah.
And so the main thing that I try to encourage the homeschooling families that we're working with in Chicago is, don't think about this as something that is just like, I'm going to save my kids from, the bad. But this is, it's good for that, praise the Lord. But this is also a vehicle that God can use to pull other people out of darkness. And so what does that look like practically? Talk to folks at church. Talk to folks, were in your kids' football program or baseball. And what I love about it is talk to them about homeschool. When you talk to them about homeschool, you get to talk to them about why you homeschool. Because I want to be in my kid's life. I want to disciple my kids. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, because they've got this stuff that I believe. And all of a sudden now I can get them to the gospel instead of, I have to walk up to somebody, are you ready for Jesus Christ's return?
Okay.
Which, some of us do that. Like, I'm a pastor. I'm expected to do that, right? But some folks don't do that. But to walk up to somebody and talk to them about homeschool, is a easier on-ramp. And I think those are kind of bridges that we need. And so that is what I encourage the folks who we are kind of connected with in Chicago. It's like, just talk about this, encourage people toward it, make people know that it's not impossible. In my spaces, honestly, I'm telling people all the time, like, homeschool is not something that only white people do. Like, there are all types of people who do homeschool. And so whatever those conversations are and those opportunities are, just avail yourselves of those opportunities. I don't know if I should refer anymore to Bill Hybels, but God has used him to do a lot of good things. And one of the things that he used to talk about, I think the book is called Walk Across the Room. And it's this idea that in opening up a conversation, then I open up all the possibility of God. And I don't have to take any responsibility for where a person ends up in the conversation. All I got to do is walk across the room, say hello. And I think it's the same dynamic with homeschool.
Yeah.
Just start the conversation.
Yeah. So in North Carolina, we've made a particular effort, as our audience knows, to reach new demographics of homeschoolers. And of course, in North Carolina, like everywhere, Black homeschool families, Hispanic homeschool families, and others has just been growing so much. Do you have a word for those families who are making that decision or struggling and thinking maybe that's not my space?
Yeah. I will say two things. One, sometimes you got to walk through a door that doesn't feel open to you, and you got to open it yourself to get access to information, resources, those types of things. And the second thing is that while I haven't looked at outcome data specifically for the state of North Carolina, I've looked at a lot of outcome data for a lot of places all over the country. And by and large, the children of Black and brown people are doing very poorly, just from an academic point, in public schools. And so I always think about those. Now I'm messing up the story. The 10 guys sitting outside the city, and they can either sit here and die, or they can go into the city where they think they're going to be killed. And they say to each other, "Why sit we here until we die, right? And we're going to take a chance, and we're going to go to the city where we might be killed. But if we sit right here, we're definitely going to die."
Okay.
So, and God ends up driving out the army from that city, and they actually don't die. And what I'm always saying, this is my pitch to Black and brown folks in Chicago all the time. Maybe you might mess your kids up, but they already are messing your kids up.
They're definitely going to get messed up there.
Definitely getting messed up there. So even if they don't learn anything with you,
that's great.
It won't be any worse than what they learned there, and at least they'll act right because they'll be able to see your life. And so that's kind of what I say. It's like, let's, if we're trying to bring together a movement that, at least the formal structures have been dominated by people from a culture that you are not a part of, there are going to be machinations involved in bringing that together. But let's lean into that process because this is important for our families. This is important for our communities. And, if you're like me, like I'm very concerned with justice and equity and liberation and all those things. And to me, homeschooling is one of the most revolutionary ideas that we can introduce to the education space that our children have been trapped in for a really long time. Yeah.
Okay. Any last encouragement for the families? Anything else you want to add before we?
I do, and I tried to share this in my session. I have a particular heart to encourage those folks who have been at this for a long time, right? So, probably you're not homeschooling anymore because your children are like my age. But just to know that, one, the seeds that you've sown, I really believe God's going to bring a harvest, not just for your children, but also for this broader movement. And two, to know that God's not done with you yet. As this movement does expand, people are going to need mentors. People are going to need folks to train, folks to encourage and speak into their lives. So just today I have like a real burden in my heart to encourage that group who have been at this for, as I like to say, almost a long time.
That's right. All right. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
This is an honor. Thank you.
Good. Okay, it's time for some wisdom from the Word. I want to tell you a story happened last week. My 11-year-old son was about to go with me to go pick up his older sister. He just wanted to ride along, and it was at night, but the lights that usually come out on the driveway were not on, and so it was very dark and he couldn't see. I was getting in the car, and there Isaac was frozen on the sidewalk. He couldn't come out into the driveway. I said, "Come on, what's going on?" And he said, "I can't come out. The lights aren't on. Turn the lights on." And he explained that he was so scared of snakes that he would not come get in the car unless the lights are on so he could see that there was no snakes in the driveway. He said, "It is my greatest fear." He didn't have to come, and I wasn't going to get out and turn on the lights. So I just said, "You're going to have to make a decision. Get in, or I'm going without you." And so finally, with a great cry of courage, actually, no, it was more like a scream of terror, he ran to the car and jumped in. Anyway, I think we can relate to this story in a couple ways. One is many of us have a great fear of snakes, but the other one is that fear paralyzes us, doesn't it? Fear paralyzes us. Some of our greatest regrets in life are failure to take action because of fear. I was just at a conference last week for homeschool leaders, and it was about courageous leadership. And I had a chance to share from Joshua chapter 1, which, of course, is a great chapter about courageous leadership. I want to read from chapter 1, verse 7. "Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go." And then again in verse 9, "Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Now, why did Joshua need courage? You probably know the story. Joshua was the brand new leader of the Israelites after Moses. They had been wandering around in the desert for 40 years, and now they were at the edge of the promised land again, and they were about to enter in. And he had to lead them in. 40 years ago, they even had failed. I bet he had a lot of fear, a lot of doubts. And so God is saying to him, "Be strong and courageous, for you will take the land and you will take this people in." Now, here was my question as I was thinking about where I need courage or what things I'm afraid of as a leader. And I also want to think about not only leaders, as in homeschool leaders, this might apply to you, but also parents, because we are called to be courageous. And here's one of the reasons why, and that is God has called us to a battle. We need courage to fight the battle that God has called us to. And here I had a pretty discouraging or disappointing thought, and that is, what do I need courage for? Well, the only time you need courage is when you're fighting a battle. So if you feel like, well, I don't really need courage, I don't have a lot of things I'm afraid of, well, here's a really good possibility. Then you're not in the battle. What has God called us to? Just like God says to Joshua, Paul says to the believers, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might." And he goes on to say, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, over the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So we know that our battle is spiritual, and God has called us to fight a war. We're supposed to fight against sin. We're supposed to fight for our marriages. We're supposed to fight for our kids and their spiritual well-being. You know, it doesn't take courage to give into our flesh or to hang around with only people we agree with. It doesn't take courage to please others or to please ourselves. It takes courage to tell the truth. It takes courage to do what is right. So the question I want to ask us today is, what is the battle that God is calling us to? What is the battle that God is calling you to? I want you to pray and think about that. Because if we don't need courage, if we're not experiencing fear, then it's likely that we're not even in the battle at all. So think about your marriage. What is it that you need to do to fight for your marriage, to learn to love your wife, to love your husband, to respect one another, to fight for the kingdom together? What about your children? Are you worried about their spiritual well-being right now? What can you do? What will you do to fight for them in prayer and in pursuing them and discipling them? What about the families around you and in your church that may be struggling, or in your neighborhood for people who need Christ? What battles is God calling you to? What's exciting is that God has given us powerful promises in his word. That's what we're going to look at next week from Joshua 1. What are the promises that God has given us so that we can have courage in the battle? In the meantime, please be praying and thinking about the battles that God has called you to, and whether or not you are willing to step up to those and fight the battle in the strength of the Lord.
Welcome to Homeschool Helps with Amanda. I'm Amanda Wares, Homeschool Helps Director with NCHE. Today, we are continuing our series on misinformation, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, so it kind of feels like this series is going on forever and ever, but I promise we are coming to an end. Today, we are continuing. This is the last segment about misinformation related to testing, but this is a big one, and I see it so often. My child scored in the 11th grade on their standardized test, but they're only in the 2nd grade. Does this mean I should put them in the 11th grade? That is misinformation. That is not how these tests work. That is not what these scores mean. So I'm going to try and help explain a little bit better what our tests are, what they're for, what their scores mean, and what we should do about them. So first off, I wanted to read a definition really quick. What is a standardized test? We have said many times in this segment, our law requires that homeschoolers that are of compulsory attendance age have to take a nationally normed standardized test once per calendar year. But what in the world does that mean? So a standardized test is a method of assessment built on the principle of consistency. All test takers are required to answer the same questions, and all answers are graded in the same predetermined way. Okay, so that's standardized. Then what does nationally normed mean? It means literally nationally normed, meaning your students' scores are compared to the national sample of students that have all taken that level of test. Okay? All right, now, what do these scores, what in the world do they even mean? I know it's confusing, but usually in your standardized test results, you will have a percentile, and wherever your child falls on that percentile, 50% is average. So anything above that is above average, anything below that is below average. And again, that is average compared to how all the other students at that grade level test performed. Okay? And it's the same thing when you're talking about the grade level equivalency. So when your student scores whatever grade level equivalent that they're scored at, that is as compared to how a student at that grade level would perform on that test. Again, I know it's confusing, but it doesn't mean that your 7-year-old should be doing 8th grade work, or vice versa. It doesn't mean that your 11th grader should be doing 2nd grade work. That's not what that means at all. And ultimately, I've said this so many times, but I'm going to say it again. We give these tests because it's required by our law. Often, it is just a hoop that we jump through. It can sometimes give you information that could help guide your choices in your curriculum choices, how you approach your homeschooling, but ultimately it's not going to give you any new information. It's not going to give you some revelation that's going to revolutionize your homeschool approach at all. And in the end, what effect do these standardized testing scores have on you and your homeschool? Nothing at all. So this is my last word on testing, so I'm going to encourage you once again, relax. Do not let this requirement in our law stress you out or stress your children out. It's a hoop you have to jump through. It can give you some helpful information if you would like it to, but ultimately, just relax. Enjoy your children. Enjoy the journey of homeschooling and let them progress at the pace and level that they need to progress at. It's all going to be okay. I promise. I hope that was helpful today.
Thanks so much for joining us this week. It never is lost on us that you take the time to spend time with us. So please send any of your questions or feedback to our email address, thehomeschoolshow@nche.com. And please help others find this show by subscribing, rating, and leaving a review on Apple Podcast and YouTube. And if you think this show would be helpful, which hopefully you do, to your friends or family, please let them know about it and suggest they watch as well. You can learn more about how to subscribe to our show as a podcast or on YouTube at our webpage, nche.com/thehomeschoolshow.
That's right. And until next week, continue to homeschool with confidence and joy.